Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone, and how are you tonight? Well, thank you very much for being with us, and welcome to the Birthplace of Country Music Museum to our monthly speaker sessions. I'm Renee Rogers. I'm the head curator here at the Birthplace of Country Music, and my colleague Sam Parker is running tech, so thank you, Sam. We are very excited to be hosting Lisa Sorrell tonight, bootmaker Lisa Sorrell tonight. She will be with us to talk about the history of bootmaking and specifically the ties between cowboy boots and country music. And this is just a precursor to a very exciting partnership that we are going to be having in the fall of next year, 2025, when she will be back with us doing an exhibit of 5 months on bootmaking, and several of her boots will be on display, which I'm very excited about. So before we get started, I just have a few little housekeeping things. If you haven't been here before and you need to use the restroom, they are just down the hall and on the left outside of this performance theater. If you need to leave before the program ends, you are welcome to do so. Just be sure you leave out of the double doors right outside of the performance theater. The front of the museum will be locked in the next 10 minutes and you won't be able to get out that way. There will be audience question and answer time afterwards, so please think up things that you would like to know more about from Lisa. And if you are joining us from YouTube, feel free to put questions in the comments and Sam will share those with us. We always send a survey out afterwards just to get your feedback and to hear what you liked, what you would like different, other topics you'd like to know about later, because this is a program that we do every year. So please fill that out. And then finally, please consider sharing a donation after tonight's program. There is going to be a link in the YouTube comments for anyone who wants to donate online, or we have a donation jar here at the front just to my right. The museum offers mostly free and low-cost programming to our community, and any donations help us to keep those programs accessible and engaging and are very much appreciated. And now, very quickly, let me introduce you to tonight's speaker. Lisa Sorrell is an award-winning artist working in the medium of leather. She makes shoes, cowboy boots, and leather art pieces in her shop in Oklahoma, working from flat pieces of leather and the client's measurements and using hand tools and vintage machinery. She maintains a portfolio of original designs and is well known in the bootmaking world for her design skills. Sorrell enjoys speaking and writing about cowboy boots and cowboy boot making. Her book, The Art of Leather Inlay and Overlay, is a textbook on the topic of creating art with leather. Please now join me in welcoming Lisa to the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. We're really excited to have her here, and I'll hand it over to you now, Lisa. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Okay, my clicker tonight is Sam. So, Sam, we can move to the first slide. Yeah. George Jones sang, "Imagine life without them, all your radio heroes." But today I want you to visualize something a little bit different. Country music without cowboy boots. Would the sound and the history of country music be different without cowboy boots? For example, what if George here were wearing high-top sneakers? Yes. What if Porter had worn his flashy wagon wheel suits with black dress shoes? What if Webb Pierce and Mel Tillis had traded the Wrights to I Ain't Never for a pair of Wolverine steel-toed work boots? The association between country music and cowboy boots has been so close and so ordinary that the footwear became a clue to the type of music being performed. I believe that cowboy boots are as integral to the history and the presentation of country music as nudie suits. But the lack of general and specialized knowledge around footwear has created a blind spot. We don't see cowboy boots because we don't have the foundation of knowledge necessary to understand them or even speak about them accurately. While there are researchers who love cowboy boots, there's no field of research focusing specifically on them. They're not cataloged fully in museums. There's never been any true academic research into the history of cowboy boots and their history. With that thought in mind, I want to show you a few examples of how there are still untold stories in cowboy boots and country music if we only know where and how to look. Sam. This clicker works pretty well. First, let's take a look at how vocabulary can inform or misdirect us. The most common mistake I see is using the word tooled to describe fancy cowboy boot tops, but it's usually incorrect. Tooling refers to stamping or carving heavy vegetable tan leather, which is a type of leather that will take such an impression. Tooled work does exist within cowboy boots, but it's not common. This is a pair of cowboy boots I made with carved boot tops. I don't do leather carving. That's an entirely separate craft, so I had a friend of mine do the leather carving on these light-colored pieces. Sam. Viewing cowboy boots with an educated eye can inspire curiosity about the boot and its story. For instance, here's a pair of Hank Williams boots that have intrigued me for years. The focus of my curiosity is that patch on the outside of the boots, and these boots are on display at the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville. I have a very difficult time believing that that patch was part of the original design. Let me tell you why. Sometimes people will say to me, "Oh, you make boots from the bottom up," and I correct them and say, "No, I make boots from the top down." What I'm saying is the boot tops with all of the decorative work is done first, while it's flat. The round white patch with the initials is really awkwardly placed. You can see how it's covering up some of the stitching, and there was no attempt to make the stitching accommodate the patch. Also, it's sewn directly over the side seam. The side seam on a pair of cowboy boots is very stiff and bulky. If you're trying to sew over the side seam with a patch like this, as you approach that side seam, your presser foot is going to bog down and your stitches will get smaller. And then once you climb over it, if you're not careful, the presser foot's going to jump, and then you'll have a big stitch. Also, once the side seams are done, the boots are a tube. There isn't a typical boot shop machine that can reach down into the boots and sew this nicely. It would take a patcher, which is more common in a shoe repair shop. All of these things make me think that the initial patch was an afterthought. Something happened here. There's a story. Perhaps the machine that was sewing the side seam malfunctioned and took a big chunk out of the side of the boots. If that's the case, if I could get hold of the boots and look down inside, I would be able to see that. Or maybe Hank showed up to pick up his boots and said, "Hey, where are my initials? I told you I wanted my initials on them." And maybe this patch is just an effort to appease the customer and avoid remaking the boots. Or maybe the guy who was finishing the soles with black dye had a little oops moment and something needed to be covered up, again, to avoid remaking the boots, which is never any fun. Obviously, I have a vivid imagination when it comes to boot shop stories. That's because after 34 years in boot shops, both my own and someone else's, I have either personally made or seen someone else make all of the mistakes. Next slide. Here's a photo of a pair of nudie boots. They were made with chrome tanned leather, which tends to be brighter and glossier, and they feature a technique called buck stitching. Buck stitching requires using a punch to cut small slits in the leather and then lacing a narrow strip of leather in and out to create decorative stitches. This particular pair of boots has buck stitching with 2 rows of machine stitching on either side. When I look at this boot, I immediately have 2 thoughts. One, this would have been a fast and easy design to make. Nudie probably created a boot that's colorful and interesting, but I'm guessing it would have been really relatively inexpensive because nothing about this design would have required the best craftsman's skills. Next slide. I also wonder if maybe Nudie pioneered the use of buck stitching on cowboy boot tops. I was able to find an example of decorative buck stitching used on a riding shoe offered by Hire Boot Company in 1926. So that's buck stitching you see around there. Hire was a pioneer in cowboy boots, possibly the very first cowboy boot maker. This catalog image tells us that buck stitching as decorative work on shoes and cowboy boots existed at the same time and in the same factory. But I haven't found many examples of buck stitching used on cowboy boots until Nudie began using the technique, often in extremely complex and elaborate ways. For example, next slide. This is not a Nudie boot. This is a reproduction of a Nudie boot that I did several years ago. And if anyone in the audience has a good memory for cowboy boots and you remember the original 1960s Nudie boot, you'll notice that these are taller than the original 1960s Nudie boot. The customer who commissioned this pair wanted an exact reproduction but taller, and that's the reason the design looks a little stretched out and there's more background space. This particular design was in no way fast, easy, or inexpensive. These boots took a very long time to make. Also, I want you to look carefully at this buck stitching. When I recreate something, I'm obsessive about the details. So I noticed there are places where a Nudie had the slits for the lacing at an angle. And so this made the buck stitching, it forced it into little triangular shapes. I thought that was very clever. See that down on the wingtip, they're straight, but up here, they're little triangles. So I've given you this long explanation about buck stitching and its use on cowboy boots as an illustration of the stories that we lose. We still retain general knowledge about clothing, so stage wear can be cataloged and described. Most museums have staff that know the difference between applique or embroidery, or they know who to ask if they don't know. They know words like lapel and sleeves and buttons. But most of the words and knowledge about cowboy boots now reside entirely within the craft of cowboy boot making. They're unknown to anyone outside the culture, and the knowledge and the vocabulary has been lost so entirely that there's usually not even an awareness that we're missing something, that there are questions to be asked. So what else could we be missing? Next slide. As I explore the question of why and how cowboy boots became the footwear of country music, I keep running into Ernest Tubb. He seems to have been on the ground floor of bringing cowboy boots from cowboy music and into the mainstream for country music. Legend has it that bootmaker Charlie Dunn invented the twisted rose technique, and Ernest Tubb bought the very first pair of rose boots from him in Austin, Texas, sometime around 1940. This would have been during Ernest's early years, around the time he recorded Walking the Floor Over You. He did 2 Western movies in Hollywood in 1942, so he could have either been preparing for that or inspired by the movie star cowboys that he met while he was in Hollywood. Hillbilly music doesn't appear to have had a Western-themed dress code at this time, but the music's sound, its name, and its presentation were quickly evolving. Cowboy boots were already popular in normal footwear in Texas, where Ernest lived. They were also strongly associated with entertainment on the feet of movie star singing cowboys. Sometime during these years, cowboy boots made the leap from Western movies and cowboy singers to the stage and the feet of the hillbilly music that became country music. Next slide. According to Lloyd Easterling, Bill Anderson's bootmaker, Ernest Tubb is the one who brought a young and newly successful Hank Williams to Dixon Boot Company in Wichita Falls, Texas, and introduced him to handmade cowboy boots. Many country music stopped by Dixon Boots in those days, so welcoming a new one wouldn't have been that unusual. As the story goes, Hank was enthralled by all of the cowboy boots. He began taking boots out of the boxes and trying them on, and soon the showroom was a disaster. One of the Dixon brothers, probably Noble, and Noble's in the center here, kneeling, came out of the back and was not pleased to find a showroom that looked like it had exploded. Ernest noticed the impending outburst, drew Noble aside and said, "You see that young man over there? See that suit he's wearing? He has a roll of $100 bills in every pocket, and he's going to be a star. Let him try on boots. With this photo, I was able to position Ernest Hub at Dixon Boots with Noble and Andy Dixon and feeling comfortable enough to be photographed in a way that would advertise that relationship. I collect images of classic country stars. Oh, next slide, sorry. I collect images of classic country stars where their boots are visible, and these are harder to find than you might think. A few years ago, I saw this image of Hank Williams, and I was completely captivated by that tiny bit of boot I could see. Once I began looking, it wasn't too hard to find more images of Hank Williams wearing these boots. He wore them often. In all my years in this business, I still have not seen another wingtip this unique. A wingtip is a separate decorative piece of leather over the toe, often in a contrasting color. And for cowboy boots, sometimes it's very intricately cut, and it will bring in different colors of leather. They're almost always symmetrical. Seriously, it's so rare to see an asymmetrical wingtip that I couldn't find another picture to show you, and I've never personally done one. The wingtip on this pair of boots is smaller on the inside of the foot. It extends farther back on the outside of the foot. And is that a butterfly hovering above the wingtip edge? Given how incredibly difficult it is to link poor, partial photos of cowboy boots on country stars to specific makers, I assumed that I would forever admire the genius of this maker without ever knowing who they were. Next slide, please. Recently, though, I had the opportunity to talk to Johnny Dixon, whose father, Noble Dixon, was one of the owners of Dixon Boots. The boot company is no longer in business. All of the assets have been dispersed. Some of the memorabilia was lost in a file, and all Johnny has left is a few photos. Imagine my surprise to see this one. Next slide. Oops, sorry. Yes, here we go. Here's a group of men in the showroom of Dixon Boots, posing for photos and displaying their handmade boots, and the seated man is holding a pair of boots with the very same asymmetrical butterfly wingtip. This image was the final piece of the puzzle, and a strong hint that the story of Ernest Hub introducing Hank Williams to cowboy boots at Dixon Boots might possibly be true. I can place Ernest Hub at Dixon Boots. I have Hank Williams in a pair of boots with a very unusual design, and I can now confirm that wingtip design did belong to Dixon Boots. We may need to thank Ernest Hub a lot for cowboy boots and country music stage wear. I knew you'd get that, Dallas. Next slide. I found the Hank Williams Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and I emailed them to ask if they had any more photos of boots that belonged to Hank Williams. Beth Petty, the director of the museum, replied to me immediately, and she sent me photos. This may be the pair that we saw earlier on Hank Williams' feet on stage. I'm also intrigued by his use of the color gray. Gray is not a very common leather option, and it wouldn't have been a standard color option of the day, which makes me think he probably requested the color gray. And you can see that his wife Audrey had a matching pair as well. Next slide. This is another photo from the Hank Williams Museum, and there's another pair with the same wingtip, but both the foot and the wingtip are gray, so it's a little harder to spot there. Hank must have loved that butterfly wingtip as much as I do, and he also appears to have had a preference for the color gray. The green eagle boots on the left are also a Dixon design. When I bring back the group photo at Dixon Boots, you'll notice that Andy Dixon, who's kneeling on the right in the image, is wearing the boots with the same eagle. Next slide. That's the same eagle boot top. I will state here that identifying makers by eagle design can be tough because everyone had an eagle design. Eagle designs are common, but in this really weird kind of way. Bootmakers would have multiple designs featuring many rows of stitching or butterflies or flowers, but they typically all had one eagle design. There's only so many ways that you can inlay an eagle so it fits on a boot top, and copying each other or taking designs and going to work for someone else wasn't uncommon. However, it's rare to find a bootmaker who can copy another maker exactly. Between ego and a lack of attention to details, small things tend to change. Or thinking back to the nudie boots that I did with the buck stitching, sometimes the customer requests something that changes the design. To identify this eagle boot as belonging to Dixon, I counted the number of feathers and I observed how the points curled up or down. I noticed that the top bands are exactly the same, and I found the stitching on the foot from Hank Williams' boot. I found that stitching on another Dixon boot. All of these things together convinced me that Hank Williams' eagle boots were also made by Dixon. So this is Andy Dixon wearing the eagle boots. And Hank was evidently a frequent customer at Dixon. It's satisfying to conclusively solve the question of the butterfly wingtip boots. I recognized how unique that wingtip was. I tracked the boots over the years, and I found their story. Next slide. But the history of cowboy boots is riddled with myths, misunderstanding, and misinformation. Let's talk about the high cowboy boot heel. Legend says that the high cowboy boot heel was for bulldogging cattle, which means planting your heels in the dirt to stop a cow. While a cowboy might perform this maneuver out in the brush on a young unbranded calf with no access to a corral, they were smart enough not to bail off their cattle pony and try to stop a fully grown steer with nothing but their boot heels, unless they were showing off for their buddies or entertaining the crowd at the rodeo. But this places us back in the world of entertainment, not function. Jay Griffith, my first bootmaking mentor, was born in Texas around 1920, and he made his first pair of cowboy boots at age 13. He worked in multiple boot shops over the course of his career, for and with some of the original architects of the cowboy boot. In other words, he was closely connected to the beginning of the American cowboy boot. I remember one day when someone came into the shop and unwisely began explaining to Jay the function of the high heel on a cowboy boot. Jay was frequently in an alcohol or lack of alcohol, sometimes, induced bad mood, and he did not suffer fools gladly. I can clearly recall him practically chasing the guy out of the shop while yelling, "The purpose of the high heel is to look purty," and that's spelled P-U-R-T-Y, purty. So how did cowboy boots make their way from the saddle to the stage? There's a fact about cowboy boots that is frequently overlooked or forgotten. Cowboy boots have always been associated with entertainment. Remember, the original cowboys driving the cattle north on the trail were not wearing cowboy boots because they hadn't been invented yet. After the cattle drives ended, moving and caring for cattle still existed as a job, but the idea of the cowboy also moved into the imagination and the mythology of the nation. How did that happen? Through entertainment. Rodeos, events where cowboys performed wilder, more challenging, and occasionally completely invented versions of their daily tasks for an audience, began in the 1890s. The first films in the United States were often Western themed, leading seamlessly into silent Westerns, usually popular Western shows and movies, singing cowboys, Western swing bands, and straight onto the stage and the feet of country music stars. Next slide. I think I skipped a slide. So let's go to the next one. There's a pretty picture of cowgirls. So just for your information, the early rodeos did not exclude women. And the argument was, we're going to exclude women because they might get hurt. But really, the real reason was women were doing very well and they were beating the men. So then they had to push women out of rodeos. And that's the reason that that photo was of women cowgirls who were performing at rodeos. Okay, so I have a higher boot catalog from 1926. And I find it interesting that the first few pages feature entertainers of the day endorsing higher boots. Will James was an artist and author who briefly worked as a movie stuntman in his youth. Ruth Rowland was a stage and film actress. Tex Austin was a rodeo promoter. William S. Hart was a movie star, possibly the very first American movie star. Make no mistake, cowboy boots were and are an essential part of the working cowboy gear. During this same time period, the early Blucher catalogs were advertising that their boots were made for working ranch cowboys, with no mention of celebrities. So already you can see this push and pull happening. Are cowboy boots for work or play? Are they art or are they craft? Are they gear or are they stage wear? For me, the history of cowboy boots is the history of the decorative work that embellishes them. There was no functional reason for this to happen. A cowboy's practical, utilitarian riding boot could have done its job without yellow butterflies and purple flowers on the boot tops. The colorful embellishments on cowboy boots illustrate their association with entertainment from the very beginning. In spite of how common cowboy boots were and are in country music, they frequently go unnoticed. Photos will cut people off at the knees, which is my pet peeve, by the way. Or the image description will credit the maker of the clothing and ignore the boots. I have a theory for why this happens. We use words to describe what we see, and it appears that language may also shape our perception of reality. For instance, the Himba people, an indigenous people in the country of Namibia, do not have a separate word for the color blue, and they're mostly unable to distinguish the color blue from the color green. I'm fascinated by this because the question is obviously, can they see the color difference between blue and green, but are unable to describe it without a word? Or does the lack of a word prevent them from seeing the difference? When we do not have words to describe something, we not only lose the ability to talk about it, we may even not be able to perceive it fully. So, with that thought in mind, let's learn some cowboy boot words. Next slide. We'll start with one of the most important phrases, boot tops. The upper part of the boot, where most of the decorative work happens, is the boot top. Each boot has one front panel and one back panel. Together, they form the boot tops. The boot tops are not called the shaft. I used to do high-end events like the Smithsonian Craft Show, and I had posters with common boot terms around my booth in an attempt to educate people. For my boot top poster, the print portion said that the word shaft should only be used in conversations about divorces, gold mines, and trashy romance novels. Next slide. The previous pair of boots features an original design that I got from my mentor, Jay Griffith. This image was taken from a catalog advertising Jay's work, one of the first boot shops that he owned himself. If you look through old cowboy boot catalogs, you'll observe makers copying and updating each other's work through the years. But this design simply appears suddenly in Jay's catalog, stunning and perfect and original. Sometimes people say to me, you're good with color and design because you're a woman. And I always tell them everything I know about color and design I learned from a grumpy old man. Jay called his design peyote flowers, but I name all of my boots after bluegrass and classic country songs, so I titled my version, If Heartaches Had Wings. Next slide. The first embellishment to grace the top of cowboy boots, the least expensive and the most common, is decorative stitching. Decorative stitching was originally functional. Civil War boots were typically unlined, but in the years following, boots began to be lined with another layer of leather. At this point, bootmakers began adding one row of decorative stitching just to hold the leather to the lining. Now, the stitching usually ranges from one row to up to around 10 rows. You can do more than 10 rows, but it begins to get a little crowded, so most boot makers stop at 10. In today's factories, there are machines that do multiple rows at once. But in my shop, I have an old Singer machine, uncomputerized, single needle, and this is 10 rows of stitching that I've done 1 row at a time on my old Singer machine. Next slide. The original cowboy boots were made in small factories. A one-person boot shop like mine may have been an anomaly, even though it's normal today in the world of handmade cowboy boots. These weren't factories as they exist today, though. Shoemaking factories now, shoemaking means somebody pushes a button and the machine squirts out a marshmallow you can put your foot in. These were factories where boots were being made by hand by real shoemakers working side by side. Typically, the top stitching was done by women, and I was really excited to find this newspaper article because this is the first time that I've seen the women pictured and identified anywhere. The article identifies several tasks in a factory. This man at the bottom is a clicker. The reason he was called a clicker, he's cutting out the pieces. So the heavy cardboard patterns were edged with brass to prevent wear, and as the makers cut out the patterns, their knives would hit the brass and make little clicking sounds. So the men who cut out the leather pieces were called clickers. This man up here is crimping a vamp. I know that sounds like a nonsensical phrase to you now, but stay with me, I'll explain it in a minute. I also love the image on the top right because that shows the work that they were doing at the time. There are always things left out of catalogs. I've had customers bring me designs, and so I can't put that in my catalog because I'm not going to offer that design to someone else. I've also made boots that I never, ever want to make again, so I'm not going to put that in my portfolio so you can see it. So this opportunity to see what they're actually working on at the time is invaluable. The boots that caught my eye are at the very bottom in the center with the stars. In spite of the fact that the first decoration mentioned for cowboy boot tops is an inlaid star, stars weren't a particularly popular choice. Butterflies, flowers, eagles, diamonds, and hearts became much more popular. Next slide. Star boots made me think of this image, which I love. This isn't it great? This image is from approximately 1875. So the construction for this boot is not yet a cowboy boot as we recognize it today. But you can see there's a desire for something fancy and cool. The design here appears to be stamped gold foil rather than inlay, overlay, or stitching. This image is kind of like a link between the early plain black utilitarian riding boots and the fancy cowboy boots that cowboy boots became in the 1940s. I'll let you admire this for a few moments longer. Next slide. Here's a pair of cowboy boots with only stitching for decoration. I made these boots for myself. I enjoy naming my own personal boots after songs about working too hard, not making enough money, and just generally having a really bad attitude. So these are titled Another Day, Another Dollar. Yeah. I keep promising myself that someday I'll make myself a pair and name them Bony Fingers, although after years of making boots, arthritic fingers might be more accurate. Next slide. The first design technique that included additional pieces and colors of leather in addition to stitching was inlay. If you cut out a hole and you put a different layer of leather behind, that's inlay. There are reports of inlaid stars on one-piece riding boots in the late 1800s, but inlay work on what we recognize today as a cowboy boot doesn't show up in the higher catalogs until 1918. Vintage boot catalogs like this one are often the best or even the only way to track what was happening in early cowboy boot history. So if you own early boot catalogs or if you know someone who does, please let me know. Next slide. It wasn't long before cowboy boots sprouted colorful flowers and butterflies. It's important to note here that flowers and butterflies are traditional themes for cowboy boot tops. They're not considered feminine. They were simply common and accepted designs. This is a reproduction of a design made by L. White in Austin in the 1940s, so I titled them Lily's White Lies. Next slide. So one reason for the prevalence of flowers, butterflies, and occasionally eagles on boot tops was simply practicality. A typical cowboy boot top has a scallop that comes down into the center of the boot, and then it has the boot tongue that extends up into the boot top. This leaves you with kind of an H shape for decoration. Flowers are great to twine around and fill that shape, but butterflies and eagles with their outstretched wings also fill that shape well. Here the customer has requested a phoenix instead of an eagle, but the idea of those outstretched wings to fill the space is still the same. I'm proud of the title for these. They're titled, By the Time I Get to Phoenix. Next slide. Overlay is an alternate way to add different colors of leather to a cowboy boot top. Inlay is cutting a hole and putting a different color piece of leather behind. Overlay is cutting a shape and laying it on top. Once you master stitching, inlay, and overlay, they can be used together to create incredibly intricate designs. Here's an overlay design titled Rose of My Heart. Next slide. You'll notice that there's a decorative strip of leather around the very top edge of the boots. This is called beading. It's a strip of leather that's wrapped around a small cord. This same technique, if any of you are into fabric, this same technique in fabric is called piping. The cord inside the leather makes it round and fat. When it's laid along an edge, the bulk of it hides that raw leather edge. These boots are titled Hillbilly Rock. Next slide. Since cowboy boots are pull-on boots with no laces or buckles to adjust the fit once they're on, the proper fit is resistance when pulling them on so your feet don't slide around once you get them on. You need something to grab as you're pulling them on, and those are called pulls or ears. There are many styles of pulls, but these are the ones I do most often. The first one is an over-the-top pull on a pair of boots titled If We Make It Through December. The next one is a spade ear on a pair of boots titled Kansas City Star. And the final one is a mule ear. See how long it is? It's a mule ear on a pair of boots titled It Hurts Me More the Second Time Around. Next slide. The final pair in that series were made for Chris Malpas of the Malpas Brothers, and they're a reproduction of a pair of boots worn by the Leuven Brothers. You can kind of spot them up there. The Leuven Brothers sang It Hurts Me More the Second Time Around. The Malpas Brothers love the Leuven Brothers as much as I do, and my copy would be the second time those boots were made, so that's why I chose the title. Next slide. Side welt is similar to beading, but it's also a strip of leather wrapped around a cord, but side welt goes in the side seam. And what it does is it opens out over the stitches of the side seam and helps protect that seam. So with this pair of boots, when I was making these, my son came into the shop, and I did all these letters pretty much freehand because they were so small. And so when I was doing saloon, I was worried that I would run out of space, and my son walked by, and he goes, if you run out of space, you can just make it a salon, and it can be a very well-groomed Western town. These boots are titled Out Among the Stars. Next slide. So I said that the boot tops with a front panel and a back panel are two pieces of the typical four-piece construction. The other two parts are the foot and the heel, but these parts have specific words also. The foot part of the boot is called the vamp. One of the things that makes cowboy boots so difficult to make is the fact that the vamp is one large piece of leather, and it has to be stretched and pulled into a completely three-dimensional shape. Most boot makers stretch the vamp over a board before sewing it to the boot tops. The process of stretching the vamp over a board is called crimping the vamps. Remember that guy from the higher photo was crimping vamps. These boots are titled There's a Star-Spangled Banner Waving Somewhere. Next slide. The heel part of the boot is called the counter, but further explanation is needed. Almost all boots or shoes are heavier in the heel area to hold your heel in place and support your heel. Inside a cowboy boot, in the heel area, there's an extremely thick piece of leather. This heavy piece of leather that wraps around the heel is the actual functional fourth part of the construction, even though it's not visible unless you look down inside the boots. What you're seeing when you look at the outside of the cowboy boot in the heel area is the counter cover. And the only function of the counter cover is to look purty. These boots are titled A Good Year for the Roses. Next slide. The last is the wood or plastic form that gives footwear its shape. A last is not foot-shaped, it's shoe or boot-shaped. However, it's designed to accommodate a foot, hold it in place, and balance the foot properly. Lasts are very specific to the type of footwear being made. You can't make a lady's ballet flat on a hiking boot last. You can't make a pair of athletic shoes on a high-heeled pump last. Lasts are also have a predetermined heel height. I own a business that sells leather tools and supplies to other boot and shoe makers, and I carry 7 different last models with different heel heights ranging from 3/4 of an inch to 2.5 inches. The side seam is the final step of sewing all the pieces together. The side seams are sewn with the right sides together, and then you turn it right side out. So they're wrong side out, and then you turn them. And that's not easy either. This pair of boots is ready to be stretched tightly around the last, which is called lasting. Once the boots are lasted, they're ready to be inseamed. So this stitch is all sewn by hand. That's what gives me forearms like Popeye. Inside the boots, your foot rests on a piece of leather called the insole. A narrow strip of leather called the welt is hand sewn to the boot through the insole. This stitch is the foundation of the boot. Inseaming holds the uppers to the sole, to the insole, and then the sole is attached to the bottom, to the insole and the welt. Next slide. After the sole is added, it's stitched to the boot through the welt. Bespoke shoemakers sew this seam by hand, but cowboy boot soles are traditionally sewn on a massive machine called the curve needle. Remember that cowboy boots developed alongside the Industrial Revolution, so it's traditional for cowboy boot makers to use more machines than is historically accurate for shoemakers. Since the curve needle is sewing very heavy leather, it has an awl that punches the hole, and then the needle follows that awl back down through. The needle doesn't have an eye, it has a little hook, so it follows it down through and it grabs the thread and pulls it back up. The curve needle is the boss of every boot shop, and it is always treated with respect, deference, and occasionally outright fear. There's no heartbreak like spending hours and hours and hours and hours making a pair of boots, and then the curve needle eats them. A cowboy boot sole is pegged with small wooden pegs. Have you ever heard this saying, a square peg in a round hole? Maybe you thought that referred to someone who's out of place, but really that's a good thing. The awl that punches the hole is round, but the wood pegs are square and slightly larger than the awl. When you drive a square peg into a slightly smaller round hole, the tension created holds it tightly in there. So being a square peg in a round hole is exactly what you're supposed to be. Next slide. You all know our final vocabulary word, which is heels. I'm including it because the assumption is often that they're made of wood. Actually, they're made of multiple layers of leather. The sole is made from stiff, heavy leather that's about 1/4 of an inch thick. The heels are made from this same leather. The layers are added one at a time, and each one is leveled before adding the next layer until the proper heel height is reached, and then they're finished with a rubber heel cap. So I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and learned many new things, but I also hope that I've failed to explain something fully enough and you have lots of questions.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was awesome. So if you'll wait to get the microphone for your question so that our YouTubers can hear, but who's first?
We have one in the front row here.
Oh.
Who has been your most difficult client?
I am not naming names. I'm just gonna say my husband. No, actually, he's not difficult at all. I just make whatever I want to make and say, here, honey, these are yours. But it's not so much that I've had. Actually, the most difficult type of client is the one who wants something specific. They know they want something specific, but somehow we're unable to communicate. They can't tell me what it is they want, or I'm not understanding what they want, and that is very frustrating for both of us.
Who's next?
I don't know if you said, how long does it take to make some of these boots or a boot?
An average pair of boots in a shop like mine, I'm the only person there. I have a lady that works in my shop running her own business making boots, but I don't have employees in the boot shop. And I've got around anywhere from 50 to 80 hours in a pair of boots, depending on how complex they are. But probably 50 to 60 hours is common. But there's a lot of times where they're wet and they need to dry, so it is not efficient to work on one pair of boots. You always want at least two, so you can kind of leapfrog over. Just because I say 60 hours, that's not, I start now in 60 hours, I'm done.
So what is the difference between the boots wearing the pants inside or outside? Are they larger around to wear the pants inside, or is that not standard?
That can depend on the culture and the area you're from. There are places in Texas where everybody wears their jeans tucked in, and there are other places where cowboys would never do that because it's weird. And so it can be culture and area. When you measure a customer, you do need to ask them, do you plan to tuck your jeans into your boots? So you know if you need to accommodate their leg and their jeans. But yeah, it's just kind of personal preference more than anything.
These I'm wearing, couldn't put my jeans in here, but I do reenacting, and my cavalry boots are all made for the pants that go inside.
Yeah, it's mostly just personal preference. Are you going to wear your jeans inside your boots or not? Or just wear them with skirts.
Anybody else? Okay.
Can you talk about the different types of leather? Because I saw kangaroo listed on one of the flyers.
Kangaroo is one of my favorite leathers to work with. Kangaroo is very thin, but it's also very strong. And so when you're doing an incredibly intricate inlaid and overlaid boot top, if you use a heavier leather, then you're just going to get so much weight. So kangaroo is ideal for anything that's very intricate, which is mostly what I do. So I use kangaroo for the boot tops. And then for the foot, I prefer either a nice calf or ostrich or American alligator is my absolute favorite leather to work with for the foot. But there are lots of different kinds of leather. There's horse, there's elephant, but those are the ones I like to work with.
So you have some absolutely wonderfully intricate designs here,
Thank you.
but I'm curious, are there any that if a customer was to come and ask you for, something, you draw the line? Where's your boundary on intricacy in the boot?
There's no real boundary on intricacy. I've had a few times where a customer asked me for something that I really didn't want to inlay. I've always said that I'm not going to inlay nipples. But intricacy, test me. Let's see what I can do.
I was going to say something, but I'm not going to say the joke I had in my head. Could you talk about, you had an image there with women in cowboy boots, and I was just wondering, you had this great presentation talking about how entertainment, cowboy boots made their way into this whole world because of entertainment and this Western costume that people would, personify themselves with and create these characters. Could you just talk about women's role and like when did women start sort of using cowboy boots as costumes for like in country music?
Women didn't always use cowboy boots in country music. If you look up like Kitty Wells or Loretta Lynn, they're often wearing high-heeled pumps. I talked to Dolly Parton's, the lady that takes care of Dolly Parton's wardrobe, and she said that Dolly Parton had never owned a pair of cowboy boots. So women didn't always have to, but it seemed to become standard for the men. And that's just one of those things that women didn't have to, but men, it kind of became just like the footwear of choice.
Could you price those that are pictured up there, please?
This is embarrassing for me. So a few years ago, I started a business where I sell leather tools and supplies to other boot and shoemakers, and it took over my life. And I really enjoy it because it is a way to support my craft differently. But with that thought in mind, it takes all of my time, and I'm not very good at saying no. So I just started my boot prices now at $10,000. And so those prices would be like, I'm just guessing, like 11,000, 13, because they have alligator again. This would be around 13 or 14. That one, those are so hard to make. So when you're stitching a design, the goal is always, now this E pluribus unum is in gray, but everything else is stitched with white thread, and the goal is to start here and go all the way around and come back to there. Those take so long, and half the time I get lost. And so that would be around a $15,000 boot. And then those, the Satan is Real. I love the Louvin Brothers. Satan is Real is their most iconic gospel album, so don't laugh. They're wonderful. And the Satan is Real, probably around 12 or 13.
So before these came out, you showed the picture of the man with the long boots with the stars on them.
Yes.
Were they just plain boots at that time, or what were they actually wearing? Were they wearing brogans up to that time? And when did the taller boots start coming in?
Some people were wearing brogans and some were wearing, those were a one-piece front. So the front was one piece. That had to be crimped because you had this flat piece of leather that you had to, and the one-piece front was the most common style of boot until around 1890, something like that. But they were already putting some decoration on it, so you can see this evolution happening.
Was the same for was the heel? I always thought the heel was to keep your foot in the stirrup.
You know, I don't really think it is, because when I go to rodeos, I see cowboys walking around in Ariats, like the tennis shoe looking things with the tiny heel. The high heel, it's the rounded shank did snap into an oxbow stirrup. Like those fit together. But I think the high heel was mostly for vanity, because when you wear a high heel, it makes your legs look longer and your butt look smaller, and cowboys were all about vanity. And also, if you remember, if you've read about the Native Americans, some of them, the higher class ones, would have not only beaded moccasins, but they would be beaded on the sole. And that said, I'm so important, I don't walk. And I feel like there was a lot of that with cowboy boot heels. Like, I don't get off my horse. I'm a cowboy.
What would you say your inspiration was as you're getting into the business? And, you mentioned your mentor, but was it something, back with your family, growing up, and then also your inspiration moving forward, and
What got me into cowboy boots, my mother began teaching me to sew at age 12. I was raised in a conservative little church where the ladies all wore long hair and long dresses, similar to Mennonite. And she began teaching me to sew at age 12. By 15, I was sewing clothing professionally. And when I was 20, I married, and we moved from Missouri, where I had my established business. We moved to Oklahoma. And I answered an ad in the paper for stitching boot tops. I had no idea what that meant. I'd never worn cowboy boots, but it sounded like sewing. And I got the job and I was figuring out what in the world was going on here because I didn't even know that people could make shoes. And I remember I'd been there probably 6 months or so, and Jay showed me a newspaper article of a lady in Albuquerque named Dina McGuffin, whose father had taught her to make cowboy boots, and she was the first woman to own her own boot shop. And I felt like a cartoon character with a light bulb appearing above my head, and I was like, I could be a boot maker. And that's when it happened for me. I loved every part of making boots because in my culture, girls did girl things and boys did boy things. And so cowboy boots satisfied my urge to work with colors and do fancy decorative stuff, but I also got to pull and stretch and hammer. And so it was like that perfect marriage of art and craft and masculine and feminine, if you want to look at it that way.
We see how much time is put into these. How much would the materials be for a pair of these boots?
Not that much, actually. Material cost is the smallest part. It's all labor. Like I can use the best materials, with the exception of alligator. Alligator costs me money. It's an expensive skin. And, leather does cost money, but it's still the smallest part. It's all the labor involved. And not only, it's not just labor, it is specialized, highly skilled labor. It takes years to learn this craft. And it's scary trying to shepherd this craft into new generations because most people can't afford to work for free for 5 or 10 years while they learn these skills, but you can't sell boots until you get the experience. And so it's a very difficult time trying to transition into someone who can support themselves making cowboy boots.
Did you start making other things before boots? Other types of leather goods?
No, when it comes to leather, I made clothing, but when it comes to leather, I've only ever made cowboy boots. I've badly made a couple of belts or handbags, but really, I'm a cowboy boot maker.
What happened to Dixon's?
They just, sometimes they just fizzle out. Andy and Noble got old, I assume. And I know Johnny told me that Noble divorced his mother, and then his mother got a settlement against the boot company. And so then Noble could never own it, actually, because of that. So, things just happen where they don't continue. And sometimes you can't find anyone who wants to purchase it and keep it going.
I wonder if there are any still around anywhere that you could. Would there be identifying marks on them to say they were Dixon boots if you happen to find them in a vintage place?
I'm not sure the identifying mark for Dixon, but often they would stamp them. I think they stamped them inside because Johnny did have one pair of Dixon boots and you could see the little stamp inside. I stitch inside the back panel of a pair of cowboy boots. There's a reinforcement that's slick so your heel will slide in, and I stitch my initials or my logo into that. I've always said people may hate my boots, but they're never going to say they're maker unknown. They're going to know who it was. Yeah.
How about the hire company there?
Hire. I'm not sure. A lot of times, a really popular type of pull was a cloth pull, a woven cloth pull, and some of the companies would have those woven with their name embedded into it.
I mean, that company is no longer either, or are they still around?
Hire. Yeah, they started back up with a grandson or something, but I mean, it's not like the original Hire boots.
Okay, thank you very much for everything. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I wonder if you found, getting back to the kind of country music and bootmaking connection, have you found that, particularly during the sort of what I think of as the kind of heyday of costumery with country and western musicians, was there... I know a little bit, enough to know that sort of the nudie suits, and then Manuel sort of became more elaborate and more flamboyant and kind of more variegated, for lack of a better term, over the years. Is the same true with boots? Did they kind of evolved or became more ornate?
It's true, but in the opposite direction. What many people don't realize is that the cowboy boots were first. People were wearing incredibly intricate cowboy boots before nudie began making fancy rhinestone suits. And I feel that Nudi's father was a shoemaker, so I wonder if perhaps he wasn't inspired by the boots that were being produced. The absolute golden age for cowboy boots were the 1940s. The work that was being produced then was just amazing. And then as it got harder and harder to find workers and fewer people began entering this trade, everything and more stuff was being produced in factories with machines. It just got plainer and plainer. I will say that we're moving into another exciting time in cowboy boots where there are so many young makers. And sometimes when I use the word young, I don't necessarily refer to age, just how many years they've been in the business. There's so much cool stuff out there. The lady that works for me, Flora Knight. There's a guy named Graham Ebner in Austin. There's a lady that in Boise, Idaho, or no, she's in Idaho, Morgan Buchert. I'm going to miss somebody because there's so many cool boot makers out there. Just get on Instagram, follow Graham and Flora, and you'll find more. Follow me. We're in an exciting time for cowboy boots. But whether or not the trade will survive is another question, because we're also in a time when we're losing suppliers. That's why I started the supply business, because it doesn't matter how good we are. During the pandemic, we came this close to losing wood shoe pegs. There's only 3 companies left in the world that still produce them. They all quit during the pandemic. They all said, we're not going back. One of them was using leftover Civil War equipment that can no longer make wood pegs. 2 of them were that was in the US. 2 of them were in Europe. One closed down completely as far as making wood shoe pegs. The other one finally, after begging, came back online. So now we're down to 1 peg factory in the entire world. So that's the issue there. It's not young people, it's the supplies.
I have 2 questions. One, can you talk about the different types of sewing machines you have? And then 2, is there some kind of mathematical reason why heels on boots are angled the way they are?
The heel angle is just to look pretty, but also to reduce weight. I mean, imagine if you've got a 3-inch heel and it's straight, made of multiple layers of leather, it's going to get heavy. And so if you angle it, that will reduce some weight, but it's also going to put a swagger into your step too, the way it's angled. And then the sewing machines, I have a Singer 110W from the 1940s. If you get an old machine like that, it may be great or it may be completely worn out. You never know. So there's a newer alternative to that. The next one is a post machine. So a post machine is like a normal sewing machine, except the bobbin is up in a post, and that way you can get into tighter areas because you've got all this free space around the bobbin. And then I have a machine that sews the side seams, and I have the curve needle that sews the soles, and then I have a finisher that has sanding wheels for shaping the heels and shaping the last, because with those last, I don't use those as is. I'll put build-ups on them to accommodate someone's foot if they have a bunion or a high instep or whatever. So I'm using the sander all the time to shape things. And those are my 5 basic machines.
Anybody else? It's been a great Q&A. Do we have anyone on YouTube with a question, Sam? Awesome.
So, Kate asks, do boot makers such as Dixon Boots ever leave a maker's mark anywhere on the boot to indicate who made them? It doesn't sound like it from your investigative work. Why not?
They usually did, but sometimes it fades. Johnny had 1 pair of Dixon boots, but it was very faint, the stamp inside. Some boot makers didn't mark their boots in any way. I remember Jay and we made 1 pair of boots at Jay's that I actually got him to sign the boots, but that's the only boot I know of, and I own it, that he actually signed it, because for some reason he refused to do it. So there are many, many boots out there that are maker-owned. They're stitching or little things like that, but it just depends on the maker whether or not they put maker's marks inside them.
Jennifer asks, Lisa, are there modern-day country performers who you feel are doing their part to carry on the cowboy boot tradition/evolution?
I am the wrong person to ask about modern country music in any way. I'm still back here listening to the Louvin Brothers. I'm really not sure. I hope that they are. I would love to see modern country musicians get into the nudie suits and the fancy boots and really carry that tradition forward as well.
And Sheldon asks if there are lasts that can be used for flat-footed males or people with pronating steps and stuff like that.
Some of that would be accommodated by the way I customize the last for them. Like I would use a standard last and customize it. But the first thing I would do is just suggest that someone with a flat foot go with a lower heel. Because when you put a lower heel, it's automatically going to spread out some. As you raise the heel, everything gets narrower because that's what happens to your foot. So a lower heel is going to give more space and support for a flat foot.
And then I have a question.
Sure.
But when you were talking about materials and types of leathers to work with, I was wondering, are there any leathers that are very hard to work with or that you don't like to work with?
Stingray all the way. No, Stingray. So if anyone has ever touched Stingray, it feels like it has little glass beads on the surface. You can run your fingers across it and it just goes scritch, scritch. But the leather underneath is very thin and fragile. So if you try to pull it, it tears. And we talked earlier about crimping the vamps. One of the things that leather does that we don't often recognize, we all know it stretches, but another thing it does is compresses. You can take one big wrinkle and make it into multiple tiny little wrinkles. It will compress. Stingray does not compress at all. It's incredibly difficult to work with, and no matter how good you are, it looks like you stitched it as a blind kindergartner because the needle is always deflected by those little beads, and the stitching is just always going all over.
And that's all.
And I have one final question, and it sort of builds on what Sheldon asked. A lot of times when you have beautiful shoes, they're not great for your feet. Our cowboy, I know because they used to be much more functional as like a working boot in the past than they probably are now for most people. I'm sure there are people who still use them as working boots, but a lot of them are more of, like you said, this entertainment thing. What do they do for your feet? Is there a way for them to be good for people who have bad feet? As someone who has bad feet.
Right. Cowboy boots can be very comfortable. There's things I can't fix, but cowboy boots are just, if they're balanced properly and they're made for your feet, they're incredibly comfortable. I wear mine through airports. I wear them every single day to work, and I have good feet. I talked to a chiropractor one time, and he said the healthiest feet he had ever seen were on an 80-year-old man who had never worn anything but cowboy boots. So I really think the lesson to be learned here is good footwear is what you need. Not necessarily cowboy boots are what you need, but good footwear, not flip-flops, not Crocs, but good. So many people think that they need softness when really they need support. And before I forget, I've got a pair of cowboy boots up here if you want to pick them up, touch them. And then I also brought my portfolio, the one that doesn't have any pictures of boots I don't want you to order.
Well, let's thank Lisa. This has been an amazing talk tonight. And I think probably our longest Q&A session, so that was awesome. Do come up and talk to her, have a look at these in a second, but before you go, let me just tell you a few things that are coming up. We do not have a speaker sessions in December. We normally would, but we had to cancel that one due to the speaker's family needs, so hopefully we'll be able to, you'll be back with us in January instead, because we will be starting back up in January. Thursday, November 14th, so just 2 days from now at 7 p.m., we have our Farm and Fun Time show with the Wood Brothers and Lindsay Liu at the Paramount. There are still tickets available, so do that if you want to see a really good show. Songwriter Musician, our current special exhibit, will be on display through December 31st. So if you haven't had a chance to go through and see Songwriter Musician, I would really recommend you to do so. It's a wonderful exhibit. And then also, we're coming up to the holidays. If you need a good place to get some good presents, go to the museum store. But otherwise, please come talking to Lisa, and thank you so much for being here tonight.